You can hear them before you see them. The drums, not the ceremonial kind that announce triumph or celebration, but something else, something that beats at a rhythm designed to unsettle rather than inspire. The sound carries across the overgrown gardens of what was once Rome's most beautiful estate. Through the reinforced walls that weren't there a year ago, past the guard towers manned by men who speak in languages the city has never heard, and in a marble hall that once hosted poetry readings and philosophical debates, 12 girls stand frozen, dressed in silk and gold, listening to those drums grow louder. They are daughters of Rome's most powerful families. They are between 16 and 20 years old, and every single one of them knows, with the terrible clarity that comes from hearing whispered stories behind closed doors, that they are about to discover what happens when an emperor decides that civilization is optional. Before we go deeper into what unfolded in that hall, I'd love to know where you're watching this from. It amazes me that a story this dark from the 3rd century still matters to people across every continent. Drop a comment and let's see how far this reaches. The year is 237 AD, and Rome is being ruled by a man who should never have touched power. His name is Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, though history will remember him as Maximinus Thraxmaximinus the Thracian. He is the first barbarian ever to wear the imperial purple, the first emperor to rise from the absolute bottom of Roman society through pure military violence, the first ruler to never set foot in Rome itself during his entire reign, and according to sources that struggle to find language adequate to describe what they witnessed, he is the most sexually depraved emperor in Roman history, not because of excess in the way Nero was excessive, or madness in the way Caligula was mad, but because of what his body made possible. Because Maximinus Thrax was not built like other men. The ancient historians report with the nervous precision of witnesses documenting something that exceeds belief that he stood 8 feet tall, that his hands could encircle a man's skull, that his strength allowed him to kill a lion with his bare hands, while Emperor Caracalla watched and applauded, that he required 40 pounds of meat and 7 gallons of wine per day just to function. Modern scholars believe he suffered from gigantism, a tumor on his pituitary gland, flooding his body with growth hormone, transforming him into something that witnesses described less as a man and more as a force of nature contained in human form. And when this giant seized power in 235 AD, when his soldiers wrapped him in imperial purple after murdering the previous emperor, when he looked at the Senate that had always considered him barbarian trash and decided to teach them what military power actually meant, he built something that Rome had never seen before. He built a system, an apparatus, a machinery of terror that processed aristocratic daughters with industrial efficiency. The estate had belonged to a senator before Maximinus confiscated it on fabricated charges of conspiracy. It was beautiful once Greek architects had designed the gardens. Egyptian marble lined the halls. The finest artists in the empire had painted frescoes showing pastoral scenes and mythological grace. It represented everything Roman civilization valued: refinement, taste, the peaceful enjoyment of wealth earned through centuries of family service. Maximinus gutted it completely. He let the gardens overgrow into deliberate wilderness that obscured sightlines and made navigation impossible without guides. He built walls, military-grade fortifications with guard towers. He covered the elegant frescoes with hangings that depicted acts designed not to arouse, but to terrify. Bodies arranged in positions that emphasized domination and pain. He installed medical facilities in rooms positioned for rapid access from the private chambers, because what he planned required immediate physician intervention or participants would die. He constructed detention cells in the basement where girls could be held between sessions. Small rooms just large enough to lie down, clean but crushing in their isolation. He hired servants exclusively from frontier tribes, barbarians who felt no sympathy for Roman aristocratic daughters, who saw these girls as enemy offspring, deserving whatever happened to them. He refined procedures through 3 years of practice, learning what broke people most efficiently, what created the maximum psychological destruction, what made survival worse than death. And then he sent the invitations, not to senators, to their daughters. Polite summons written in the formal language of imperial bureaucracy, requesting their presence at gatherings, noting that attendance was expected and that the emperor looked forward to their company. No explanation of what the gatherings involved, though everyone knew. The stories had spread through the senatorial class like infection. Stories about girls who attended and returned changed. Stories about the sounds that carried from the private chambers despite the soundproofing. Stories about something called the special entertainment that sources reference repeatedly but refuse to describe. Using euphemisms that create more horror through suggestion than explicit detail could ever achieve, Senator Marcus Junius Balbus had made one mistake. 2 weeks before his daughter Lucia received her invitation, he had stood in the Senate and raised mild objections to a new round of property confiscations. He didn't even object, strongly just noted that perhaps due process should be maintained, that perhaps families deserved hearings before losing estates their ancestors had held for generations. He was careful, respectful, avoided any direct criticism of the emperor himself. But someone reported it. Someone always reported it. Maximinus had built informant networks throughout the city that were thorough enough to catch conversations whispered behind closed doors. And now the papyrus had arrived at the Balbus family villa, destroying Lucia's world in the time it took to read 3 formal sentences. She was 18 years old. She had been raised in protected aristocratic spaces, surrounded by books and music and gardens, preparing for a marriage to some senator's son who would value her education and family connections. All of that vanished the moment her father read that invitation aloud, because everyone understood what it actually meant. Everyone knew that these gatherings were not honors but punishments, that daughters suffered for their father's courage, that what happened in Maximinus's private chambers created damage that survivors could not speak about and families could not heal. 3 days later, Lucia stood in her finest purple silk in that marble hall, wearing gold jewelry her father had given her, her hair arranged in elaborate curls that had taken hours to position. She looked like what she was supposed to be, a young woman honored by imperial attention. She felt like a prisoner being transported to execution. The other 11 girls around her wore similar expressions, that terrible combination of aristocratic composure, trained since childhood, overlaying pure animal terror. They recognized each other from social functions. These daughters of Rome's most powerful families, they didn't speak. What words existed for this situation? What could they say that the drums and the distant sounds beneath the drums weren't already communicating? Then the door opened, and something that shouldn't be possible walked into the room. 8 feet of muscle and bone and mass that defied natural proportions, shoulders wider than doorways, hands that looked carved from stone, a face with heavy features and prominent brow that growth hormone excess had transformed into something between human and geological formation, and eyes that looked at 12 aristocratic girls dressed in silk and saw not people but resources, not individuals but entertainment scheduled for systematic processing. Maximinus moved through the hall slowly, studying each girl individually, not with lust in any recognizable sense with assessment. With the clinical evaluation of someone selecting tools for specific tasks, he stopped in front of Lucia, reached down with surprising gentleness, and tilted her face upward until she was forced to look directly into eyes that contained nothing she recognized as human emotion. "This one," he said, his voice so deep she felt it in her chest, his accent marking him as the barbarian frontier soldier he had been for 30 years before seizing power. "This one will demonstrate the special entertainment tonight." Servants came forward. They took Lucier's arms firmly enough that resistance was impossible, not roughly enough to leave marks. Not yet. Hay escorted her toward the door at the back of the hall, the door beyond which the sounds had been coming from, the door that led to the private chambers where the machinery operated. The other 11 girls watched her go, relief that it wasn't them yet. Terror, because they understood their turn was coming. Maximinus had refined this, deliberately making witnesses watch created anticipatory fear that amplified their own suffering when their moment arrived. The fear built through observation, through imagination, through the terrible human capacity to envision what awaits. By the time each girl's turn came, the psychological destruction was already halfway complete. What happened beyond that door is documented in fragments scattered across ancient sources that struggle to find language adequate to describe it. The Historia Augusta references unspeakable violations Herodian mentions, acts that exceeded the capacity of normal men to commit casual rites of entertainments that required immediate physician intervention. Modern scholars mention these passages briefly, then move quickly to safer topics: fiscal policy, military campaigns, the political instability of the crisis of the 3rd century. They don't know how to handle an emperor whose primary historical significance is systematic sexual predation. Don't want to dedicate scholarship to documenting organized abuse when there are more comfortable research subjects available, so they bury it in passive voice and euphemism and academic distance. But the sources tell us, if we read carefully, they describe the medical facilities positioned for rapid access. They mention multiple victims per gathering. They note that survivors emerged with injuries physicians couldn't explain to families' internal damage, suggesting impossible mechanics, fractures requiring deliberate force, trauma exceeding what sexual violence normally produces. They specify that sessions lasted hours because Maximinus's endurance exceeded normal human capacity by orders of magnitude. That what would exhaust an ordinary man barely registered for someone whose body required 40 pounds of meat daily just to maintain function. They record that witnesses were required, that the other girls were forced to watch, that anticipation was weaponized as systematically as the physical acts themselves. Lucia survived that first night. The physicians treated her injuries, stabilized the damage, prepared her for detention until the next session. Because gatherings didn't process girls in single sessions, they were distributed across 3 to 5 days, with detention periods in between where fear could build, where bodies could heal just enough to endure more. By the time Lucia was returned to her family a week later, something fundamental had broken. Not just physically, though the physical damage was severe enough that her family's physician examined her with visible confusion. Unable to explain injuries that seemed to require forces beyond what human anatomy should produce, but psychologically, she had dissociated during the entertainment as a survival mechanism. Her mind had partitioned the experience away, locked it somewhere consciousness couldn't access. Except locked away doesn't mean gone. The trauma continued, affecting her through symptoms she couldn't explain. She panicked in enclosed spaces. She couldn't tolerate being touched. Certain soundstrums, flutes sent her into states of distress so severe her family had to physically restrain her. She stopped eating regularly. Sleep became impossible because dreams made the partitioned memories accessible, vivid, unbearable. She existed but didn't live, functioned minimally but not meaningfully, survived in the biological sense while being dead in every way that mattered. 2 years later, Lucia Unia Balba died at age 20. Her heart simply stopped. The physician said, "Natural causes," but her family understood. She had died because carrying what Maximinus had done to her required strength she no longer possessed. Because 2 years was as long as she could survive after those gatherings. Because the special entertainment continued killing her every day until finally it succeeded. She was one case among dozens. The senatorial families of Rome buried numerous daughters in the years following Maximinus's death, girls who had attended gatherings, girls who had been selected for special entertainment, girls who survived the palace but couldn't survive its aftermath. The machinery Maximinus built processed over 100 aristocratic daughters during his 3-year reign. Some died during gatherings despite medical intervention. Some survived years before trauma killed them. All were broken systematically by an apparatus designed specifically for that purpose, built with state resources, operated with bureaucratic efficiency, enabled by an infrastructure that made systematic cruelty possible at industrial scale. The gatherings ended in 238 AD when officers in Maximinus's own army decided they'd had enough. Not because of moral objection to what he did to senatorial daughters, because he was leading them toward military disaster. He was besieging Aquileia, a small city that had closed its gates because its citizens understood that surrender meant their daughters would receive invitations, that survival under Maximinus meant worse than death. The siege lasted months. Maximinus's soldiers starved while he continued consuming 40 pounds of meat daily. The contrast became unbearable. In April 238, officers entered his tent and stabbed him repeatedly. They mounted his head on a pole and paraded it through camp, showing the army that the giant was dead, that the reign of terror was over. The soldiers who had followed him for 3 years didn't mourn. They cheered, not because they objected to the gatherings, but because his death meant survival, meant they could negotiate with the Senate rather than facing destruction in civil war. This is what finally broke the machinery, not resistance, not moral awakening, but practical military calculation. The apparatus dissolved immediately. The palace was seized, the servants scattered, the physicians disappeared. The evidence was destroyed systematically because Rome wanted to forget. But survivors couldn't forget. The damage persisted for decades after the emperor who inflicted it was gone. The daughters who had been broken remained broken. The families who had lost girls to gatherings or to the slow deaths that followed never recovered. The senatorial class learned lessons about silence and submission that reshaped Roman political life for generations. They learned that speaking truth purchased suffering, measured in daughters' bodies. They learned to be careful, to phrase objections in the most obsequious language possible, to understand that some emperors used power not just politically but intimately, that absolute authority plus physical abnormality plus appetites shaped by 30 years of military violence created possibilities for cruelty that exceeded anything civilization had prepared them to handle. What remains now are stones and ruins and fragments of sources that struggle to describe what they witnessed. The estate where the gatherings happened is gone, demolished or buried under later construction. The command quarters along the Danube, where Maximinus spent most of his reign, have been excavated. their isolated architecture revealing spaces designed for privacy that could easily become spaces for concealment. Aquilere still stands, its memorial commemorating brave resistance, without mentioning what the citizens were actually resisting. What they understood surrender would mean for their daughters. The comfortable, heroic narrative preserved while the uncomfortable truth is buried. And Lucia Uniabalba, 18 years old when the invitation arrived. Dead at 20 after 2 years of carrying damage her civilization couldn't heal, rests in a tomb that says only she died young. No explanation of how or why. No acknowledgement of what killed her. Just another aristocratic daughter lost during the crisis of the 3rd century. Her suffering reduced to, footnote, her story erased by scholarship's preference for political economy over confronting systematic abuse. Except now you know. You know what the gatherings were. You know what the special entertainment involved. You know why survivors couldn't speak about it, and families couldn't heal it, and Rome tried to forget it? You know, because Lucia deserved to have her story told completely, without euphemism or academic distance or protective language. Because understanding how infrastructure enables systematic cruelty helps us recognize similar patterns wherever they appear. Because the machinery that destroyed Herthawals, and the procedures and the physicians and the bureaucracy and the apparatus that made organized abuse possible at scale, that machinery still exists in different forms, still operates, still requires recognition and dismantling. Because remembering is not just about honoring the dead, but about learning from their suffering how to prevent future iterations. Because 17 centuries later, the least we can do is refuse to let scholarship's silence complete what Maximinus's cruelty began. She was real. Her terror was real. Her suffering was real. Her death was real. And now, finally, her story has been told. The drums have stopped. The doors are closed. The palace is empty. But Lucia remains carried forward, not in marble or bronze, but in knowledge, in the recognition that some histories are too dark to forget, too important to sanitize, too revealing about power and bodies and violence and human capacity for systematic cruelty to leave buried beneath comfortable lies. She remains in your understanding now that will have to be enough, that will have to be her memorial. The truth spoken plainly after 17 centuries of silence.